Well, hello, my yachtista friends. Welcome back. Now, I promised you last week that I would go through the steps of how to purchase a boat. But, you know, I was in the thinking closet here, and I realized that we're really not ready to actually go through buying a boat yet, because we don't know one of the most important things about your boat, and that is the head. Now, you got the Marine Sanitation Device, more endearingly called the shitter, or perhaps even the crapper. And it is very important that you understand what you're looking at and what you're going to buy. Because if you buy the wrong one, you're going to have a hard time convincing your family to go on long cruises for you. So, sit back, enjoy. This is Poopology 101. And if at the very end of this video, I'll give you a secret of how to maintain your head, your marine sanitation device, so that it doesn't stink. And that is worth a pot of gold, because a stinky head really, really impacts your cruising enjoyment. So stay tuned to the very end and let's get started.
We are Matt and Monique, parents to 5 beautiful daughters and 1 dashing son. With 5 of our parental responsibilities out of the house, we made a life-altering decision to sell everything and set out on a journey of a lifetime with our youngest daughter and her dog Guidos. Our journey would take us from Sacramento to San Francisco, then to Mexico. From Mexico, we would continue on to Panama, through the canal, and then to Florida to begin America's Great Loop. We began this journey on January of 2022, but with several hiccups and delays, we only made it to Ensenada, Mexico. We anticipated beginning the 2022 Mexican cruising season on December 10th, but on November 26th, a serious infection would derail our plans with a month hospitalization and 6 months of medical treatment. Our journey will have to wait until the 2023 cruising season. Until then, we will share our knowledge and experiences and show how we will continue to improve our skills, the condition of the boat, and how we provision for the longest journey we have ever made.
So marine sanitation devices have come a long way from the days of the poop deck, where you'd walk to the back of the boat and poop. Today, toilets are in the boats, and how we handle the sewage is actually regulated by the federal government. In 1976, the government actually passed a marine sanitation's law, which required all new vessels to be equipped with a marine sanitation system. And then by the 1980s, any boat that was still around that didn't have a marine sanitation device was required to install one. And that created some issues as far as plumbing and where to put the holding tank, where to get the water, so forth and so on. Today, any boat that has a toilet has a marine sanitation device, and those devices basically come in 3 different designs, shall we say. You have either the push, pull, or drop method. The first method to talk about, which is the one that I know least about, so we'll get that out of the way, is the drop method. And that is your composting toilets or your toilets that just drop into the holding tank. I'm not a person who knows anything about the composting head. I know that, and I'm not ever going to know anything about the composting head. The idea is just not something that interests me at all. The composting head theory is you poop in one area of the toilet and you pee in another area of the toilet. The poop goes down into a storage bin, which is filled with coconut fibers or some sort of fibers that will help compost the waste. And the urine goes into another part which has to be emptied when it becomes full. Now, it kind of defeats the purpose if you don't have a holding tank, because you've got to take the bucket off where the urine is being stored and then dispose of that urine. And the urine buckets are not that big. So either you dump it overboard or you have to stay at the dock and take your urine up to the toilet and get rid of it that way. I think it defeats the purpose, and I'm not really sure if I want to be around with the solid waste composting. So I'm not one that is interested in a composting head. It's really big with sailors, and I think it's very big with power boaters that don't have the areas for a holding tank. So that really leaves two methods of delivery that I do know about, and I have experience in both of them. The first one is the pull method. The pull method, which is your vacuum flush method, actually sucks the waste from the toilet to the holding tank. It uses the least amount of water. It empties the most because it drops and sucks the waste out. And I think it actually is the less smelly of all of them. The downside of the vacuum flush is there are more components to go wrong, and things do break. For example, in a two-head environment like my last boat, the motor yacht, we had a forward head and then we had an aft head. Each one of those systems had their own complete vacuum flush system, but they emptied into a single holding tank, which I like the single holding tank, but that's two things, that's two systems to actually have something go wrong with it. And I've had things go wrong with my vacuum flush. One of the systems, the aft system, the switch on the accumulator tank actually went bad and had to be replaced. Easy fix. I mean, it was just very, very simple. You take the old one off, you put the new one on, you put the wires, and you're good to go. It did take me about a month to figure out that that's what the problem was, and not a hole in the hose somewhere. And then also I had a vacuum flush vacuum pump go bad, and I had to replace that. Now, interesting story there. I wouldn't have had to do one if I had known about the other. In other words, when the vacuum flush or the accumulator switch went bad and I left the boat for a while, the pump would never have gone bad, and so I wouldn't have had to replace that. The vacuum flush or the vacuum pump was fairly expensive. I think I paid $200-300 for it. I installed it within half an hour. Easy install. And even though that boat was built in 1982, it was 1982, basically everything was the same. A little bit different, but the holes all matched, and it was just a plug and play. And same with the accumulator tank, plug and play. So even though things are going to go wrong with it, it's still a plug and play repair. And honestly, it is the system that I prefer. One of the things you have to be aware of with the vacuum flush head is you have to step on the pedal long enough for the waste to actually make it to the accumulator tank. There's none of this step off and then step off real quick, because that only gets the system or the waste into the system, not into the accumulator tank and then off into the holding tank. So that's something you have to be aware of. Not a big deal. I never had any problems with it. Even when I was doing a quick step to conserve water, the vacuum was strong enough to pull the waste from the toilet through the system and eventually into the holding tanks. My current system on this boat is a push system. which means that the water actually pushes the waste from the toilet to the holding tank. Here, you have to be sure you use enough water to actually push the waste from the toilet through the hoses and down into the holding tank, because that's all that's pushing the waste down. The push system, or the electric toilet system, is the simplest system with the least amount of things to go wrong, but they still have things happen to them. On my Tollycraft, that also was an electric toilet system, and one of the kids, back when they were very young, accidentally put a baby wipe, of course we had a baby on board, in the toilet, and that baby wipe went into the macerator and got caught around the blades. So I had to take that apart and put a new macerator pump on that toilet. Again, it wasn't incredibly expensive, and it took probably an hour and a half to fix. But easy peasy, it was not a big deal whatsoever. Now, with the electric toilet system, I mentioned that there's a macerator at the pump system, and that's kind of nice because the waste, the toilet paper, anything else that's put in there gets chopped up as it's going through the system and then pumped into the hose and down into the waste, into the holding tank. You have to have enough water for it all to work. When I was sick and Monique was having to put fresh water in the boat, I tried to use as little water as I possibly could, and unfortunately that did result in a plug in the system at the holding tank. And here's some video of Monique and I trying to fix it. All right, that is nothing but coffee, so don't get all grossed up. But here is my dilemma on this toilet. If I try to flush it, it does nothing but spin around, and that spinning around is the macerator trying to chop up whatever's in there, but it's not allowing it to go any further than the toilet. So I have a plug that I have to deal with. All right, here's the hose that is plugged up. That's the holding tank down there, and here's the valve. This goes to the holding tank, and this side is direct overboard. And so I need to remove the clog out of here so that it will free flow into the holding tank. Okay, so the first thing I got to do is I need to take this clamp off here, and then I will heat this hose, make it pliable, and it should come right off. That's the plan, at least. Right there. Yeah. Take this off first. I can see all these hoses are brand new. Okay, where's the media? Right here. Okay, that's those. Now we need to get a bucket. There we go. Oh shit, did I break it? I should. No, I don't think so. Okay. Nope, that's good. All right. So just a little bit of water, and that hose is off. I'm going to try to get a coat hanger as I change my glove, because that's gross. And then we're going to see if we can push that through.
Like any absolutely great husband, he made me a pooper pusher. So I'm going to take it, put it through. Give it a little spin. Oh, I think I got the clog. I have to be careful because there is a little hook on here. I don't want to put a hole in this. And you probably don't want to see this part, so we'll just do
And,
that.
and that's homemade, so we've got to keep it in case this happens again.
Now, I'm getting a real test. I'm going to put some water down there. I think I hear it going. I'm going to get my handy dandy flashy light. I could see the water in there before. I don't really see it now. Next job, I'm going to put it back together and try to flush the toilet. Wish me all the luck in the world, because I might need it. Okay. Oh, I can probably do it now. My back just popped.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, moment of truth. Over here we have these little valves. This one's a 3 flush. This is the one you should be hitting when you put lots of toilet paper in there, but Matthew prefers this one.
I will explain it.
So let's see. Uno, dos, tres, go! Yes!
Success.
Success.
Very good.
Sorry, Martinez. I guess you're not going to be needed after all.
All right. That is boat life. Now, while this is the easiest system, it's not the cleanest system. I mean, it's not dirty by any means, but I find that there's remnants that you have to deal with. And if you don't have an unlimited amount of water to push all that system out, you just deal with it. Our system doesn't stink, although I've seen systems that do stink, but I think our system doesn't stink because of the stuff we use to prevent it from smelling, and how we manage or maintain our holding tank. And I'll show you that at the end of the video. I think it's a really important aspect to actually having a marine sanitation device on board. So those are the 3 delivery systems for your marine sanitation devices. There are other considerations when you are looking at purchasing a boat. For example, my 2 Hatterases both have holding tanks, which is really interesting because Hatteras was one of the first boats to put holding tanks on without an option. It was automatically done. They are fiberglass holding tanks, so they are built into the boat. My Tollycraft did not have a holding tank, although I put one in for the forward head, and then the 2 Egg Harbors were built without holding tanks. All 3 of those boats were pre-1976, which required holding tanks, or marine sanitation devices. So so that gives you the history of marine sanitation. And when we look at the Tollycraft, the way the Tollycraft dealt with the requirements of the marine sanitation device without putting a holding tank in is they use what's called an electroscan or an electrosan. They're 2 different systems on the boat. The electroscan is that, I think it's the newer system, and electroscan is the older system. And I might have those 2 mixed up. But the theory behind them is, well, they're the same companies. The theory, though, is when you push the waste from the toilet through the system, it goes into a small I think it's probably a 3-gallon bucket. And it's not really a bucket, but for lack of a better description, a 3-gallon bucket. And above that bucket is a lid, and that lid there is a macerator at the toilet, and then there is a macerator at the bucket. So the difference here is, on the older version, you would push the button to activate the system, and the system would then provide an electrical current into the waste bucket. And the salt water, you always had to use salt water. The salt water, or the salt in the salt water, would then react to the electrical impulses or pulses from the system and sterilize the waste. Both of the systems work the same. The newer system had some safety mechanisms that would not allow you to electrify the water if there was no salt in it, which probably was a really good idea, because when we had the Tallycraft, we were in the Delta and it had fresh water. I actually had to install a salt bucket that would mix salt with the water and then inject the salt into the bucket so that there would be salt for the electrical impulse. Once the electrical impulse was complete, it would discharge the waste overboard, and I am told that the waste going overboard is cleaner than even a holding tank that is being pumped out. Because invariably when you pump out a holding tank, you dip the hose into the water in order to clear the line, and when you dip the hose into the water, that's where there's a release of biotics that are not good for the environment. So they say that the electroscan is a much cleaner solution to the marine systems, and I guess I tend to see their argument, and a well-maintained electroscan would be very, very clean. Unfortunately, they're not always well-maintained. There are also older systems that use chemicals, and those chemicals, they're pretty nasty chemicals. There's formaldehyde, there's chlorine, there's all kinds of systems that are very, very harsh systems to kill the bacteria that is created in the waste system before pumping them overboard. Even though the systems that kill the bacteria and would make it clean to pump overboard, they're no longer legal in most places that we want to boat. Northwest, lakes, rivers, government said no dumping of any waste whatsoever, whether it's been treated or not. You're going to have to go 3 miles out to dump. And I guess that's a good thing, but I think that's also short-sighted. Anyways, when you're looking for a boat and they've got one of these cool systems, be aware that when you're in a marina or a river, especially a lake, you cannot use your marine sanitation device. You can only use it out in the ocean. Even though people will say it's the greatest system since sliced bread, and it is, be aware that if you get caught using them, you will be fined. So interesting enough, I've seen several boats that have both an electrosand system and a holding tank. And I suppose what's happening is the toilet or the waste is going to the electroscan. The electroscan is then treating the waste, and then it goes into the holding tank for disposal later. Now, I don't know if those owners are actually having the waste pumped out at the dock, or if they're going out 3 miles and pumping off or dumping their waste out there. The system sounds pretty cool, and so I wouldn't shy away from a boat that had that system, because you know that if they're dumping, you're dumping clean waste. It's just an extra step and an extra expense that today's really not viable. So that leads us to the fact that when you're shopping for your boat's going to need a holding tank, at least one. Now there are some boats that have 2 holding tanks, and some people like that option because if something goes wrong with one holding tank, they can still use the other holding tank, and the holding tanks would then be committed or assigned to one of the toilets. So if the aft holding tank went bad, you could use the forward holding tank and vice versa. Holding tanks come in 3 different types of materials. There's plastic, which today is probably the most common. There's steel, which prior to 2010 was most likely the common or most common material used for holding tanks. And then there are fiberglass holding tanks, which you're going to only find in boats that are high-end boats, such as a Hatteras or a custom boat. And that's because they're fairly expensive to produce. However, they are the best type of material to use on a holding tank because they're not going to disintegrate or expand like a plastic or disintegrate like a steel holding tank. Caution for you, if you're looking at a boat that is black iron or steel, you have a limited amount of time to use that holding tank before you're going to have to replace it. And it depends on how old your boat is or how old the boat you're looking at is before you know whether or not it's been replaced. It is a finite amount of time because the waste that's going in there is corrosive, metal is corrosive, and black iron is really corrosive. So with that corrosive effect, you are going to have to replace your black iron or steel holding tanks. Your plastic holding tanks, while probably more durable than your steel, they have other issues, and they are going to have to be replaced also at some point in the future, but probably not quite as soon as your steel. Plastic holding tanks, they're made of a polymer substance, and they do expand, and they do contract, and they do become brittle. And when they become brittle, that expanding and contracting will eventually lead to leaks, which then have to be replaced. The nice thing is, it's probably much easier to replace a plastic holding tank than, well, definitely than the steel tank. And even if you have bad luck with a fiberglass tank, that's probably the most expensive and hardest tank to actually replace because you're going to have to cut that sucker out. So maintenance-wise, yes, you will have to replace your plastic, but not before the steel, and a lot easier than if it were fiberglass. Just something to be mindful of. Oh, and the polymer holding tanks, they come in all sizes, and pretty much you can pick any one of them up at West Marine or any of those places. They're very easy to find. Another thing to be aware of, all holding tanks have vents. And what is a vent? Well, the vent is a hose that goes from the outside of the boat to the holding tank. And a lot of those vents can smell. They can smell horrible, depending on how well you are maintaining your holding tank. So they do manufacture a filter that you can put in the line for your vent that will filter out the obnoxious smells before it actually makes it out to the outside world. The vent becomes an issue when the holding tank begins to fill up and you put more waste into the holding tank. That air that's in the holding tank that's been accumulating all that noxious smells then escapes out the vent. And if you don't have one of these very expensive filters, that noxious smell goes straight out to the side of your boat, and if you're with a bunch of other people, they will let you know that your holding tank stinks and it's gross. That that vent filter will prevent the smell from getting out of the boat, and it has to be replaced once a year, and it's expensive. And if you overfill your holding tank and it goes into that vent, you've got big problems. No bueno. So it's probably better to not have that filter and just maintain your holding tank so it doesn't smell than to replace that filter every year and take the chance that you don't get to the pump out in time. My opinion. I have the filter and I maintain my holding tank, so I've got both going on and I haven't had a problem. So I've talked about the electric head and the vacuum flush as being a push and a pull. When you are looking at push toilets that use water to push the waste to the holding tank, there are other devices that will accomplish this, and you'll find this on different types of boats. For example, older boats, older power boats, and many sailboats use a manual head that will pump the water through the system and the waste to the holding tank. And that's where you actually have to use muscle to pump and get enough water to go through and out the system. Another important aspect to using water to push the waste to the holding tank is where that water comes from. And this is very important. Sailboats, older power boats with small water tanks, they are going to use river water, ocean water, what's called raw water from the ocean for the toilet, and you can use as much water that way as you want to get the waste to the holding tank. It's really nice because you're not using your valuable fresh water. It's really bad because you are actually taking water from the ocean that contains small microbes and putting them in your toilet and in your holding tank. And so when the microbes sit there in the toilet bowl and in the holding tank, they die. And then they begin to degrade and decompose. And this can be uncomfortable because it smells bad, but it can also be fairly dangerous because the microbes being decomposed create not only noxious fumes, but they're dangerous fumes. So you've got to be very careful that when you leave your boat for an extended period of time, or you don't use that toilet for an extended period of time, that you empty out the toilet bowl of all raw water. When you use fresh water from your fresh water tank, there are no microbes in that water, and so there's nothing to die. That's going to save you a great deal on any of the noxious fumes. The noxious fumes that you do smell are only fumes that you've produced, and those are much easier to take care of through proper management of your holding tank. And you don't have to worry about your toilet bowl. One of the considerations, along with whether or not you're going to use fresh or raw water in your toilet, is toilet paper. And toilet paper, it's a big issue, especially it's just a big issue. Because you're on a boat and you have to store your waste, the type of toilet paper you want to use is very important. You're not going to want to use Charmin's most comfortable, thickest padded paper that you can buy because it's comfortable on your boom boom. You're going to have to use the single ply, get dissolved real quick so that when it goes in the toilet and out into the holding tank, it dissolves and it becomes just fiber that can then be pumped out. You don't want the toilet paper could probably go through, your Charmin toilet paper can probably go through the system, but it's going to lay in that holding tank and just sit at the bottom
and then not be pumped out when it's time to get rid of it all. Because remember, pumping out a boat is actually pumping. You've got to put a nozzle down at the dock or have a dock worker, and it's got to be sucked out from the top of the boat, and it's got to go all the way. The section's got to go all the way down to the holding tank and then sucked up. And if the toilet paper hasn't been dissolved, it's going to just clump and become concrete on the very bottom of your holding tank. And eventually your 20, 30 gallon holding tank is going to be 10 or 5 gallons, and you're going to wonder what happened. Well, you used the wrong toilet paper, or the system is going to build up the toilet paper in the hoses, and you're going to have to replace all your hoses before the time comes. Now, another important aspect that you have to understand when looking for your boat, the waste hoses have to be replaced every 5, 10, or 15 years. The waste will permeate through the hoses, creating the sewage smell. So if you have that issue on a boat that you're looking for, just remember that you're going to have to replace those hoses. And those hoses can be fairly expensive to buy and to install. Not hard, just expensive. And there are some very good hoses out there now that I used on the other boat. You shouldn't have to replace those for a very long time. So when I had the other boat, I had a job, I had a house, I had to work. On Sunday when we left, I would flush the hoses out with fresh water. Put full bowl full of fresh water, and then pump it through into the waste tank. And what that did is it cleared out the sewage from the hoses so that it wouldn't have an opportunity to permeate into the hoses. If you simply leave, and you leave for a week, 2 weeks, whatever you might be leaving for, whatever waste is sitting in those hoses is eventually going to permeate into the hoses, shortening the life of those hoses so that you have to replace them earlier. So if you leave for your job, or you leave for the summer or the winter, depending on where you are, my recommendation is completely flush out your sewage hoses to save on having to replace them during the next season.
So for those people that have stayed the entire time, I have the secret of maintaining a smell-free head, along with some of the other advice that I've given you in this video. This is fantastic. And I'm not sponsoring it. It's just something that we've been using, oh my gosh, for about 5, 6, maybe 7 years successfully. And it works on both our VacuFlush system, and it works on this electric toilet system. It just maintains the head in so many different ways. And that is called Zoll No-Flex Digester. So there you go. I think you can see it right there. You can get it online, get a case of it. And what this is, it's an enzyme, but it's a better enzyme than the other ones that we've used over the past. It actually not only takes care of the smell, but will attack the sludge at the very bottom of your holding tank. When we bought this boat, now this is a 76, I don't think the holding tank was ever maintained properly. We were only able to get about 40, 50 gallons of sewage in our 80-gallon holding tank. And that was because at the bottom, we believed that there was just a lot of sludge. We used, I'd say a whole bottle of this No-Flex and pumped out. It was amazing. The amount of sludge. You could actually see the sludge coming through the little glass tube as it was being pumped out. And it just pumped and pumped and pumped. And it took about, let's say about 3, 4 full pump outs before we had a completely empty, clean holding tank. Now we can get the full 80 gallons of sewage in this boat. And unfortunately, we've done that, and it doesn't stink. So, you know, if you're driving around with 80 gallons of sewage and you don't smell it, you know this stuff actually works. So, yeah, that's my secret. Zoll's, Z-O-A-L, No-Flex Digester. It has actually worked wonders for us. And I had my brother use it on his. His boat uses raw water for his head, and it works on that too. So, great stuff. I am not being represented by this company. I'm not representing this company. Whatever it's a non-sponsored secret that I highly recommend it. So,